Hello everyone, Bandy Bono here, and who's ready to wrap up the treatise on the one God? We've got one more question to go, the Divine Beatitude, and then we're done. Well, we're done with that treatise. We have several hundred more questions to go after that, so the rest of the Summa is going to take us a while, but I've never read every single section of the Summa, but I've read, parts of a lot of it. And I've read the Treatise on the One God in its entirety before, and I've read Treatise on the Trinity in its entirety. In my opinion, things do get easier from here on out. I still think the Treatise on the Trinity is more technical, but this, in my opinion, what we've just covered, is the hardest part of the Summa, at least from what I've been familiar with. Maybe there's some hidden difficult part later on. So, if you've made it this far, well done. And hopefully it gets a little easier from here on out. All right, 4 articles today on the Divine Beatitude. Beatitude, of course, being a word for blessing. Whether beatitude belongs to God, whether God is called blessed in respect of his intellect, whether God is the beatitude of each of the blessed, and whether all other beatitude, I should probably have an S there, is included in the beatitude of God. All right. Here are our objections to Article 1, whether beatitude belongs to God. Boethius says the beatitude is a state made perfect by the aggregation of all good things. An aggregation, if it belongs in God, would seem to violate his simplicity, and that can't be. Meanwhile, Aristotle says beatitude is a reward of virtue, and reward does not apply to God. How could God be rewarded? Well, he can't. Argument from authority. Paul says that God is blessed in 1 Timothy 6:15. Argument, and I quoted this directly from Aquinas because essentially his argument is establishing his own definition of beatitude. So he says beatitude is the perfect good of an intellectual nature which is capable of knowing that it has a sufficiency of the good which it possesses. Okay, that applies to God, to which it is competent, the good or ill, I'm not quite sure what that means, maybe fall, and which can control its own actions. And that definition applies foremost to God. I think the only part that I wasn't quite clear on in this argument is, can we really say that good or ill might befall God? Maybe that's not quite what he's saying, but essentially Aquinas redefines beatitude and says, yes, that applies foremost to God. How about the objections answered? Well, aggregation of good is in God in the sense that whatever is in us is most perfectly and simply in him. And that's something we've seen before, right? That any perfection in us pre-exists first and foremost in God. Okay. Then beatitude is a reward only accidentally. In God there is beatitude, not through reward or merit. So again, both of those objections are looking at beatitude from our perspective. But since it is a perfection, it exists first and foremost in God in a way that's different from how it exists in us. Number 2, whether God is called blessed in respect of his intellect. Beatitude seems to refer to God's essence, not his intellect, and beatitude implies an end, and that would associate it with the will, not the intellect. Well, argument from authority. St. Gregory and Augustine are going to tell us that beatitude is in God according to his intellect. Argument. The previous article defined beatitude as the perfect good of an intellectual nature. The beatitude of an intellectual nature is understanding. In God, being and understanding are one. This one I was a little confused at what exactly he's getting at. But suffice to say that even if I think kind of the main point here is that we already defined beatitude in a way that links it to the intellect. We did that up there. And then we can still say it's part of his essence because God's understanding and his essence are one. Okay, objections answered. Beatitude is in God most essentially under his intellect, and then beatitude is the object of the will, but the understanding of the object precedes the act of the will. So, whoops, you don't need that screen up. Intellect precedes whatever the will does with beatitude. Okay. Is God the beatitude of each of the blessed? Let's find out. Objections. Since God is the supreme good, God must be the beatitude of the blessed. Beatitude is the last end of rational nature. To be the last end of rational nature belongs to God alone. But not so fast, because 1 Corinthians 15:41 is going to speak of beatitudes, plural, and is going to talk about how they differ. It uses the metaphor from star to star. So, since God never differs, he can't be the beatitude of the blessed according to Scripture. How does that work then? Well, beatitude can be understood in two ways. How many times have we seen that line of argument from Aquinas that, okay, to understand this, we have to kind of divide our definition in half. We should all be very familiar with this by this point. The object of the act and the act itself. So the object of the act, this is similar to what we talked about with God's will. The will itself, the decree, and then the execution of the will. Okay, so I decree I'm going to pick up my water bottle. That is my will. But then the execution of the will, comes after that. It's a similar type of thing here. The object of the act, the declaration, and then the act, the execution of that declaration. The object of the act can refer only to God, since everyone is blessed from knowing God. However, the act of beatitude differs from person to person. It is created in different people in different ways. All right, objections answered. This objection, number one, refers to beatitude as the object of the act, and then number two, God is the end of rational creatures considered in itself, but created beatitude is the end of a rational creature's fruition. So, for the rational creature, God is the end. But in terms of the rational creature's development, this beatitude, this state of blessedness, is where that rational creature is intended to end up. So it's, again, a question of perspective. Finally, whether all other beatitudes are included in the beatitude of God. Well, our objections are going to say there are some false beatitudes, nothing false is in God, and some beatitudes consist of corporeal things. There's physical blessings, right? Nice house or whatever. Things which cannot be in God, since he is incorporeal. The beatitude is perfection, and as we've already talked about, the divine perfection embraces all other perfections most eminently. Pretty basic argument. Whatever is desirable in a beatitude consists first and most perfectly in God. And that we explain this a bit more in the answers to the objections, so I'll go right into those. That, for example, the whole question of what about false beatitudes, things that seem like they're blessings, but they're not. False beatitudes do fall short of God, but whatever is in them that is true pre-exists in God. So in a false beatitude, I want to have a lot of money or whatever, and that's going to make me happy and make me blessed. Well, that's a false beatitude. It falls short of how, God's ultimate end for us. But within that, you could say that there are aspects of perfection, of good, that do exist even in what would be a false desire, and those aspects of blessing or beatitude do come from God. They pre-exist in God. And finally, corporeal things don't exist in God, but whatever good they possess does. Pretty basic argument. So again, a good home would be a corporeal blessing. Well, a home doesn't exist in God, or rather the physical building of a house, but the qualities of a home that make a home desirable, that make it a good in our lives, those would pre-exist in God in a spiritual sense. All right, we did it. That's it. Treatise on the one God. Next video, before we get into the treatise on the Trinity, I'm just going to do kind of a brief overview of it, similarly to what we did when we started the treatise on the one God. You'll notice if I scroll down here that where this treatise was 25 questions, right, because, question 1 was the treatise on the sacred doctrine. These aren't quite as long, so, we've finished a pretty big chunk here of the Summa. I guess treatise on man is a little bit longer. But, yeah, if you've made it this far, it gets easier from here on out, in my opinion. So, should be good to go. I will be back shortly with that treatise on the Trinity introduction. But for now, I'm Ben DeBono, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.